think we know it. So this session is recorded and will be available on the platform, on the Moodle platform that you have access. So this is the third session online on the second module of the Space for Business program. We have a very interesting topic that we're going to address today about Earth observation and the downstream markets, and a bit of foresight of this segment of space within the next 5 to 10 years. So I think we're very interested in knowing more about this segment and what are the prospects. We have today here Aravind from Terrawatch. I think you had the opportunity to look into his bio, but I will let Aravind to present a little bit about himself, and then you have the floor to do your presentation. Let's do this iterative. If you have any questions, please, you may interrupt Aravind, and let's really try to profit from all his experience in this so exciting space economy sector that is Earth observation. So Aravind, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Sure. So can everyone hear me all right? All right, brilliant, cool. Let's, before I get into the slide, quick introduction. So Aravind, I run Terrawatch, and I'll give you a quick intro about Terrawatch. I've been working in the Earth observation sector for the last 7 years. I run a strategic consulting firm that is Terrawatch. And I'll give you a quick intro about Terrawatch, and then we'll go through some, let's say, some trends and some, I guess, overview of the Earth observation market. And then you can obviously stop me if you have questions. I don't know, I think I'm going to probably not see you. Maybe if you can raise your hand. Is there a function here for raising hands? I think there is, maybe, so that I can see it on the side, because I don't know if someone wants to say something. I'll not be able to see it because I'm going to share a few slides. But yeah, or feel free to shout if when I'm talking. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, sounds good. Cool. So let's start with the introduction to Terrawatch, and then I'll get to the actual content. So a quick introduction about Terrawatch. So the boring way of describing Terrawatch is it's a strategic consulting and market intelligence firm focused on Earth observation. So essentially do a lot of strategic assignments, go to market studies, work with Earth observation companies, work with space agencies, work with end users, work with investors on a lot of strategic assignments. So that's a boring way to describe it. Another way that I'd like to describe it is Terrawatch works on the 3 A's of Earth observation, so availability, awareness, and adoption. So, works on getting the right technologies available. So for that, work with investors, doing due diligence on Earth observation companies, work with space agencies like ESA, like NASA, like NOAA, like UKSA, and a few other space agencies on their Earth observation strategy and commercial sector strategy, and also work on the second part. The second A is awareness. So the awareness is about how do we spread the awareness about the potential of Earth observation, and that's predominantly done through the newsletter. I'll come to newsletter in a bit, the Terrawatch newsletter. And then the last part is adoption. So for making sure that Earth observation is being used and adopted in organizations. So work with end users in different industries like insurance, banking, agriculture, finance, mining, etc. So help with them on their strategy for integrating satellite data. So, that's on the adoption side. So that's just another way to describe what Terrawatch does. So essentially, it's a consulting company doing a lot of market analysis and strategic work. So Terrawatch also has the Terrawatch Space newsletter. So that's a newsletter that's weekly, free newsletter that focuses on tracking and writing about the Earth observation market, and writing about the recent trends and applications of satellite data. So that's just another aspect of Terrawatch. Right, so just there was a quick introduction, but then let's go into the state of the EO market. So what we're going to discuss is really kind of looking at what the Earth observation market looks like today and kind of how it can grow and where it can go. What we're not going to look at is really just market forecasts or market numbers. Usually I'm not a huge fan of those, just because we have a lot of work to do, and the reality is very different from market forecast and market potential. So we're going to look at kind of real estate, the hype, and kind of where the industry is going. Right, so let's start with how the Earth observation market is kind of just segmented, at least from this is how kind of Terrawatch looks at it. Typically, you would have probably seen or heard Earth observation being segmented as data and value-added services, which makes sense. But you know, at Terrawatch, we have an opinion to kind of go deeper into what this really means, and that's why we kind of segment the Earth observation market into 5 segments. So the first segment is kind of what the segment that we all kind of look at, or probably a lot of people in this group care about, that is the related to satellites. So that is the data. So going from left to right, data is kind of the first part where it's all have to do with building and launching satellites to, you know, collect different types of data from different type of sensors. And then going, you know, towards the right, the second is platform. So platform is kind of how the data that is collected is distributed to people, how data is, you know, kind of used for processing. So platform is a place where you go to process Earth observation data. And there are quite a lot of platforms coming up, both from public and private sector. Analytics is kind of the segment where data is converted into some form of useful information. But that useful information is not useful enough, but it's just, you know, understandable. So think about, you know, things like number of trees, number of buildings, number of cars. There's a lot of work that goes into converting, you know, satellite data into information, but then that information does not mean anything, right? Like you can label a tree or identify a tree, you can identify a ship, you know, so what, right? Like you can identify a ship, so it doesn't really mean anything. It is not really valuable for anybody. But it's still, you know, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and that's where a lot of AI these days is being used for, you know, detecting a car, detecting a building, tree, etc. Insights are when the analytics are actually used for, you know, bringing value. So analytics is kind of, if you think of it as number of trees, then insights is basically doing a time series analysis over 20 years and figuring out that the number of trees has gone down. You know, that's an insight. So insights is really a derivative of analytics. And the last part is application. So application is really what the packaged final product is. So if you have a product, and I think the easiest example is probably the most successful Earth observation application is lying in your mobile phones, is the weather app. So it's an application, it's the application layer. So where, you know, you go to the weather app, you know, to do something. An application usually solves a specific problem. You know, you don't go to the weather app to book a taxi. You don't go to the, you know, the taxi app to look at the weather, right? So application is where the insight is packaged into a product, right? So that's kind of how the application layer is looked at. And you can kind of extend that to a lot of emerging use cases, right? Like if you want to go and you know, look at what is the change in emissions over an area, you know, what is the air pollution in an area, you know, you can think of that as one product with one application in which, you know, data is integrated, or the insights from the data is integrated, and that's kind of how application is defined. So the reason for doing it is really to go deeper into the sector and to understand the dynamics of the market, rather than, you know, just calling it value-added services, because the value-added service can be just spotting a ship, or the value-added service can be, you know, an alert that you get by building a wildfire detection app, for instance. So value-added service can mean anything. So I think the idea of segmenting into 5 is to go deeper. So that's kind of the value chain. Obviously, we'll start with the data and kind of, you know, go through the different segments to go deeper. To start with data, I don't think I need to tell this crowd about, you know, the data layer in terms of the public sector data, the public sector missions that are coming up. Same with ESA. So, you know, without going into this, because this crowd knows about, you know, probably, as you mentioned, one of them is probably working on this. I don't know if the Scout mission is already part of this infographic, but it's good to know that this crowd does not need any introduction about the public sector missions. But then what's interesting from a private sector point of view is the growth of commercial satellite missions. So in this slide, you can see segmentation by sensor of different companies that are launching different kinds of satellites. The Earth observation market is, you know, changing on a daily basis. So we try and keep to this as up to date as possible, but there may be 1 or 2 missing logos. So you know, you can understand the speed of the evolution of the Earth observation market just by looking at how fast this graphics keeps changing, because we sometimes have to change this every 2 weeks. That's how fast the Earth observation market is moving. Maybe one company is launching a new sensor. Another company is, coming up. It's newly founded, right? So there's so many companies coming up with so many sensors. It becomes hard to manage. But then the bottom line is there are a lot of commercial companies coming up. And I don't think I need to teach this, tell this group about, why it's happening. I think you probably have covered it in other classes, or maybe you will cover it in the classes in the coming weeks about, the reduced costs of access to space, the satellite getting a lot more commoditized in terms of the hardware, the satellite platform. So there are a lot of trends that are leading to it. But then from an Earth observation point of view, those are all important factors. Now anybody can go and launch, any sensor they want. Just a quick overview of the different sensors. So obviously there are some who might understand the sensors. There are some who might not. Obviously it's a whole different subject called remote sensing to understand all the sensors and its applications. So just as an overview, optical is the sensor that probably everybody is aware of. They've probably seen satellite images. Multispectral is really looking at 4 to 8 bands of, the image. So looking at, apart from the red, green, and blue, looking at a few other bands in the electromagnetic spectrum to get insights into specific applications. Infrared is really kind of just looking at the infrared or the thermal infrared part of the spectrum that has applications in, wildfire monitoring, that has applications in land surface temperature, and a couple of other use cases, wildfire monitoring, and yeah, then I think also emerging use cases in, looking at building efficiency as well. And I guess a couple of companies are focused on that. Hyperspectral is obviously, as the name suggests, it's, it's a lot of spectrums, and, it kind of can be anything from 100, 200, 300, 400. And I think there are companies now looking at 300 bands, 400 bands. So essentially you can kind of identify, I kind of look at hyperspectral as a way to, zoom into the characteristics of whatever you're seeing on an image. Hyperspectral really allows you to distinguish between, different compositions, minerals, species of plants, species of trees. So it really looks into the, the deepest part of the spectrum, each of the bands in the electromagnetic spectrum. On the right is kind of the what is called the active sensor, because on the left, what we have looked at is passive sensors. So passive sensors are not emitting any radiation. They are just capturing the incoming radiation. Whereas on the right, on the microwave part of the spectrum, or what is called active sensor, there is a signal emitted, and the reflected signal is caught on the sensor, and that's kind of how the image is built. So you have obviously the SAR, or synthetic aperture radar, which is probably the most predominantly talked about or used sensor. So that's on the right bottom. So there are, again, a lot of companies focusing on that, on the SAR part of the equation. So I guess the most important part of, microwave is really the ability to, work all day, all night. It's not dependent on the sun, so it can see any time of the day. And I think the next one is kind of similar, but I think, on similar in terms of the principle, in terms of LiDAR, in terms of how it works. So obviously LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is really laser signals as opposed to radio signals that we see in microwave SAR. So there are a couple of companies coming up also launching LiDAR. There were not many LiDAR satellites before, and I didn't really stop in the NASA and ESA missions because I was thinking that a lot of you might be aware of NASA ESA missions. Obviously, there was a recent mission with the LiDAR from ESA ALS. There was more of an atmospheric looking LiDAR, and that is kind of what AirMo as a company is trying to do, and they are kind of looking at the atmosphere, using atmospheric LiDAR for emission monitoring. NewView is another US-based company that is looking at LiDAR from a topographic point of view. So they're kind of looking at LiDAR from a traditional sense for mapping purposes. So LiDAR is, again, an upcoming kind of technology. We have not seen many companies come about in that area. Probably because of the difficulty of accomplishing it, but there are companies coming up. And the last part is kind of the radio signals. So the radio signals, kind of, you can kind of split it into 2 or 3 kind of for the the AIS side of the equation, which is automatic identification system, which is more for tracking ships. And obviously there's RF, which is just monitoring radio frequency signals that are being emitted from the surface, which is what some companies focus on, like Unseen Labs, like Hawkeye, like Aurora. And obviously there's also the radio occultation side of the equation, which is related to weather, looking at the reflected signals from, from the GPS and the GNSS constellation in general, and kind of using that to measure the profiles of the atmosphere. So that's kind of radio occultation. So, number of satellites that are coming up, number of sensors that are launched or being launched and about to be launched. So kind of the market is also, as you see on the figure, getting very crowded. So the future, and I think we'll talk about what the future looks like in a bit, but as you would imagine, an industry cannot support these many companies, especially with the current level of adoption of Earth observation data. But then, that's something that we will talk about later. But then, as you see here, the market is pretty crowded and pretty fragmented. So the next part is more on the platform. So on the platform side, I think what's important to kind of realize is for you to understand that it's not just all about the satellites. It's not all about, just sending the satellites up and collecting the data. It's also about what you're doing with it. And I think the first part of that has to do with, how this data is managed, how this data is stored, how this data is accessed, how this data is processed. And all of this is important because this is also part of the downstream ecosystem, because if this ecosystem is not developed, then, people are not going to create application companies, because it's going to be very hard for, people to access the data. Also, obviously, from an infrastructure point of view, things are changing. There are, many cloud providers available for storage and retrieval of the satellite data that's there. There are management solutions that are coming up that allow data to be managed. How is it stored? How is it indexed? How is the pre-processing done? And likewise, on the access side, there are APIs, marketplaces coming about with APIs that allow access to different types of data as well. And the fourth part is processing. So on the processing side, it's really where the data is converted into something useful, where you kind of go and write your tree identification algorithm or your processing algorithm for converting, the raw data into some actionable analytics. And the last part is really the analytics layer where the analytics are visualized. So that's kind of how the market and the ecosystem is organized. And going into the application side of things, so there are obviously, it's hard to even list all the applications of downstream applications of Earth observation, right? So there are just too many to list. Here it's just let's say a group of applications that are kind of categorized, and a lot of them are actually emerging applications, and a lot of them are traditional applications. And without really going through the list one by one, I think one example of a traditional application is, what you can call crop intelligence. Agriculture is a market that is not new to using Earth observation data. It has been using since the 80s, 70s, 80s, when, the first missions have been launched from the Landsats of the world to the NVSATs and, until now to Sentinel. So the agriculture sector has been a very historical user. So that's more of a traditional application. But then what's also happening right now is there's a lot of emerging applications that are coming in. One example is more in the insurance market, right? Like you can have a lot of insurance companies using, for example, SAR data to, get a better assessment of the flood before giving out, claims or, giving out the claims for people who are applying for them. They can figure out easily today whether a house is flooded or not using, SAR satellite image, as opposed to, previously they have to go and visit the house to actually figure out if there's a flood or not, right? Like, so that's just one use case where the use of Earth observation is emerging. It did not happen 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Now it is happening because of increased availability of data, but also increased resolutions and resolution from a spatial point of view, but also from a temporal point of view. So, that's just to contrast two different applications, but then, there are several applications that are coming up, and each of them have their own, let's say their market potential, and each of them are their own markets by itself, right? Like, so if you look at emissions is a whole different market. Likewise, if you look at I don't know, looking at energy monitoring or for renewables, that's a whole different market. Deforestation and everything related to forest, that's a whole different market. So you can kind of imagine each of these as their own little markets. That is going to be a consolidation. That'll be the overall Earth observation market. So this is kind of just to give you an overview of application. I'm sure some of you already know the application, so we don't need to go into details. But if you have questions, you can ask. I think what's important to also identify from a market point of view, this is also just a different way to look at the market, is the market is you can kind of split the market into two, and you can kind of see that visually in this figure here. So you see on the top what's called multi-vertical. That really means that the companies here are going after many verticals at the same time. So because satellite data, as we saw, is very used across different applications, it is possible for companies to come to focus on different verticals at the same time. But then what's also happening is you can have companies, or you can have solutions that are very, very verticalized, right? Like they are only focused on insurance, they are only focused on energy, they're only focused on environment. So the contrast of that is important to understand, because as the market grows, there is going to be an increase in number of multi-vertical companies, meaning the companies, and a good example is, any satellite company you can think of. Many satellite companies are multi-vertical because they don't stop into just selling into one market. But then there are some satellite companies, but also downstream companies that are coming, that are focused only on one market and one area because they want to solve, one specific problem. So I think that's just a one, important dynamic to kind of keep in mind as you look at the downstream market, because there's going to be growth, horizontally, but also there's going to be vertical focus growth as well. Just a quick idea of, what is the kind of funding we're looking at, how much money is thrown into the Earth observation market. This is the number from last year. So just to give you an idea, so overall funding is almost 2 billion, so 1.9 billion. This includes the funding into the application segment. And I think it's important to differentiate that as you go downstream, companies will probably not be called Earth observation companies anymore, right? Like a company in the application layer focused on delivering a crop monitoring application will be called an agriculture industry company. It will not be called an Earth observation company anymore. So, but it's still important to kind of identify that it is still part of the Earth observation market, because it is satellite data is what is driving their solution. So it's important to kind of differentiate the both. But obviously the data company, no surprisingly, not surprised that they have raised the second most amount of funding, because obviously they are the companies that are launching and building satellites. So obviously that's a lot of capital expenditure. So you will have a lot of companies that are raising money. The overall trend also to look at from a last 3 to 5 years point of view, for each of these segments, the number has been going up until 2023. But it looks like in 2023, it's starting to stagnate. We will have to see if this is also the outcome this year. It's more to do with the reality of the market, for the market to grow, for the companies to grow. They are not seeing a lot of growth. So investment is starting to stagnate, but it's still, there's a lot of potential in the market in terms of, what the potential holds in terms of applications and use cases. So it's just good to have an idea of the overall investments. And one thing that I like to do, because it's the foresight class and we're looking at the next 5 years to 10 years, is really kind of looking at a hype cycle. So this is just a hype cycle that, that I put out almost sometime last year. I don't know if there's been much change since last year, but then this is just one way to kind of look at how the technologies that are developed in Earth observation are, in the different phases of hype. And just keep in mind that this does not apply for technologies that are developed in public agencies or space agencies. This is more from a commercial point of view, where where each of them lie. So just to explain how the hype cycle works, I'm sure some of you have seen it. This is derived from the Gartner hype cycle, which kind of looks at splitting the segments into 5. So the last segment is really where you will see a lot of continued growth. That's what the last segment represents, plateau of productivity. The 4th segment is kind of where you will have a technology that is coming out of a hype cycle and kind of seeing growth, right? Like that's kind of what the slope of enlightenment is. And then the first 3 segments are really the main part of the hype cycle. So innovation trigger is where a lot of innovation starts to happen from a commercial sector. So obviously, as you see, a lot of innovations are coming in, whether it is in the form of new sensors, new type of products, new platforms, edge computing. A lot of, I guess, technologies are coming in the innovation trigger. There are some that have been around for a while, right? Like you can argue optical multispectral has been around for a while. And it's also important to kind of identify, is there really a lot of uptake, adoption of these technologies in the commercial market? Because the biggest user of Earth observation data has been historically defense, and then followed by science. But then apart from those two, there has not been a big amount of adoption, big amount of uptake of any of these technologies, which is why they are still in the hype layer today. And we have to see a lot of adoption and a lot of use of these technologies for different applications for them to kind of move differently. And I think there are going to be some that are going to be in this area. So where you see the red ball, there are going to be some technologies that are not going to make it. They're probably going to be too early. They're probably going to be not as useful as people thought. And there are going to be some technologies in this list that are going to fall into this layer, where it's inevitable. And, we saw in other industries as well, Google Glass is a good example. It was in the 2010s when, augmented reality was not even a thing. But then right now, this is kind of making a comeback. So just one example of a technology as well that came in, and you can also argue satellite communications was something like that until, Starlink recently, where it's kind of now proceeded past the hype cycle. With Earth observation, we are still not sure, is SAR going to be the big sensor that everybody tells that it's going to be? Is hyperspectral going to be the big sensor that everybody tells it's going to be? You'd have probably heard a lot about edge computing. So edge computing is the process of processing the data on orbit and delivering the insight directly down to the ground. Again, there's a lot of potential. We are yet to see a lot of, I guess, reality usage in reality of edge computing. So they're all, in the technological innovation demonstration phase, and we are yet to see what they're going to bring in terms of value to the end user. So if you have any questions, so what I'm going to do is kind of now move on to the state of EO adoption. So the EO adoption is really kind of looking at where the adoption of Earth observation is today, and kind of trying to identify where it's going as well. So one of our theses is to kind of identify that the way the Earth observation market is, and again, this is a cycle that you probably have seen. This is the it's a cycle that looks at how adoption of technologies happens, and I think you have probably heard about early adopters, innovators, and I think Earth observation is in a phase where we are still in the innovator phase, where we are still figuring out where the mainstream usage of Earth observation data is, where the potential lies, and I think until now there's been a lot of segments, as you saw, data platforms, analytics, insights, application. And if you're, someone who has not looked at Earth observation before, it is a very scary industry to look at because everybody is launching satellites. And if you don't understand what each of those sensors mean, it's very hard to even identify what you can do with all that data. So I think this is in a segment where we still have to get to the majority, and we have a lot of work before we get to do the majority. And likewise, the hype cycle for adoption can kind of tell you where where the uptake of the data is. So weather forecast, as I mentioned, is mainstream. So it's very much in the plateau of productivity. Mapping, again, disaster response, air quality. These are all applications that you're really using today, as of now, right? Like today you're using your maps. Today you're using weather forecasts. These are examples of applications that are already pretty mainstream. But then there are a lot of applications that are showing a lot of potential. And this is related to some of the applications that we saw before, right? Like carbon markets, flood mapping, emissions monitoring. A lot of these are, also, some of these are also interestingly public goods, right? Like some of these are also public sector missions. Some of these are produced by the public sector as well. But then you also see private sector coming in. A good example is flood mapping. You can get flood maps from, the public sector for public service, but then you have companies also coming in producing services in that area. So there's going to be an interesting mix of both. And, we're going to see over the next 3 to 5 years whether the public sector services actually will have a lot of value, especially when you have private sector alternatives. And it's again the same conversation what happened with weather, right? Like, are there private weather companies? Absolutely. But then is EUMETSAT and ECMWF, ECMWF producing the weather forecast? Absolutely. That's what we're getting on a daily basis. So the relationship between the two is going to be something interesting to look forward to over the next 3 to 5 years, especially as the private sector evolves. But one thing to keep in mind, the usage of Earth observation is going to be data is agnostic and source agnostic. Whatever your application, the user is not going to know where the data came from. It can come from a satellite, it can come from a stratospheric balloon, it can come from aerial aircrafts, it can come from drones, it can come from sensors installed on the ground. At the end of the day, the user is really just looking at their product on a screen and figuring out if there is if there is a value that they are getting or not. They don't really know, and also they don't really care if that's coming from satellite. This is an important part to keep in mind, because at the end of the day, whatever application we are looking at, think of any application, more likely to be derived from more than one source. So it's going to be an important component going forward, where we will see a lot of companies building solutions now only based on satellite data. Will also start integrating other data sources, because that is really going to be the way to go. Using just satellites might not be enough, because it might not give you the needed accuracy, and you need to complement it with a ground sensor, right? So I think that's kind of one thing to keep in mind as the Earth observation market grows. It's not just going to be the growth of the satellite market, it's also going to be the growth of other sources of data as well. So some closing thoughts before we go, and then we can get into questions. So the closing thoughts are more of questions and kind of things to think about and keep in mind before we close. I'd like to always say that the Earth observation sector lives in the Earth observation bubble. It's just there's a lot of things happening in the Earth observation sector, and the Earth observation industry and the professionals in the sector obviously are kind of biased by what's happening around them. But then the end users live way away from where the applications are produced today, where the technologies are produced today. So there's a big gap that needs to be filled or bridged before the market really reaches its full potential. One thing that's starting to happen is a problem-driven strategy. So, initially how satellites used to be launched, where someone had a technological demonstration that they wanted to do. So the technology was launched, and then applications were identified. And this is, again, very much on the commercial sector's point of view, not from a space agency point of view. So any company now demonstrates the new technology, then identifies the new applications, and then waits for adoption to happen. And this is kind of how the status quo has been. The status quo has always been, launch it and then wait for, let's say, the adoption to happen. But then one thing that's starting to happen slowly is more a problem-driven strategy. So there are companies that are also on the agencies front, they're starting to look at specific problems as opposed to just technologies. What problem do we want to solve? Is there a market for this problem? Does this problem need to be solved? And do you need to launch satellites to solve this problem? So a lot of these questions are being asked before a satellite is launched, because once you figure out the answers to all of these questions, you can actually launch a satellite for which there will actually be demand. So I think we are kind of moving towards that. And I think that's what's going to be the case in the next 5 to 10 years. You will see a lot more problem-driven Earth observation companies rather than technology-driven Earth observation companies. The Earth observation sector is going to, usually talks a lot about the what, right? Like the SAR, the hyperspectral, the types of sensors. But then what I think is probably needed is a lot more so what, and I think that's what a lot of end users are looking for. It's not about, you can map the Earth every day. And from an end user point of view, it does not mean anything. It can mean, you are mapping every day, but then they don't really know how it connects to them. If you're someone sitting in the mining sector or insurance sector, it's also about connecting it to the so what, which is not done as much. And one thing that we talked about is also from a future point of view, consolidation. So there's a lot of companies, as you saw in the list, there are a lot of companies that are being funded and founded. But I think consolidation is coming, and I think consolidation will happen in 2 ways. So the horizontal consolidation can be horizontal. So horizontal is really when a company who is kind of also trying to develop a platform goes and acquires a company that is developing a platform. So Planet, as some of you might know, is a satellite company. It acquired a European company called Synergize, which was developing a platform. And I think that's an example of horizontal consolidation where Planet now is interested in going to the platform layer, and it acquired the company to go into the platform layer. That's horizontal. Vertical consolidation is really when it happens from a vertical point of view, so from a market point of view. Especially, it usually happens when a supplier buys someone who is providing that capability to them. Again, if you look at Swiss Re, which is one of the biggest insurers in the world, acquired a flood risk analytics provider who uses satellite data, but then they were a customer before, and then they figured out that they needed to have this in-house, so they went ahead and acquired them. So the consolidation is also happening vertically, so it's something to keep in mind. And I think sometimes it's also important to demystify EO. I think what happens a lot in the Earth observation market is there's a lot of talk about the black boxing of the Earth observation. Satellite data is acquired, and then you get the insight. So, you see an eye here. The eye represents really what people see. What people see is, you get the satellite data and you get the insight. But then usually there's a lot of things that happens in the background that obviously the user or anyone who's using does not know or does not care about. But then it becomes very, very important to actually talk about it more, especially as a lot of companies come into the equation. Because if you're opening an app and you're looking at the weather forecast and it says that it's going to rain tomorrow, you trust it because you know that the methodology for getting the weather forecast was verified, is standardized, and you can trust it. So tomorrow, if you open a weather app, if you open an Earth observation application that says there's going to be a wildfire in this area, how do you know that that company came to that result? How do they know their models are correct, right? So I think a lot of the underlying factors are also becoming more and more important. It usually is about only the top layer. I use satellite data, I got my wildfire alert. I use satellite data, I know where the leak in my pipeline is. But at the end of the day, it also is about figuring out how to really know how this result was done, right? I think that's becoming more and more important, and it will become more and more important in the next 5 to 10 years because so many companies are coming in. So it becomes important to differentiate how company one is better than company two. So that's another thing to keep in mind as the Earth observation market grows over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's really just an overview of what I thought about the market, what I thought you needed to know as, trends and kind of outlook for the Earth observation sector. Let me know if you have any questions. But yeah, happy to dig into details. But yeah, if there are any things that you didn't understand either, because I know this group is very multidisciplinary. So if you want to go deeper into one or two concepts or one or two slides, happy to do that.
Thank you, Aravind, for your presentation. I think there's a lot of questions or tons of questions, and we have around 20 minutes of Q&A, so we can start now with the group. Wendy, first, please.
I was giving applause. I wasn't raising my hand. Thank you, Aravind. But I don't have a question at this point.
So I think next one was Sam. No, Yen, please.
Hey, thank you very much, Aravind, for the presentation. It was very interesting, especially when you're not coming from the space sector like myself, but rather from a technology point of view. When you showed us the value chain, I felt reminded on Planet, who kind of puts now into lots of their presentations the vision of becoming the Bloomberg terminal for Earth observation data. So being very much vertically integrated, right? How much value do you think derives out of being the guys who own the satellites and have the terminal, the platform at the very end, being fully integrated versus now all the companies that pop up more problem-driven, as you called it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's more a question of it's their vision. I don't think they're there yet today because in order to be a Bloomberg terminal, you need to be really a master at your domain. For example, Bloomberg terminal is the de facto terminal for anyone working in finance, in commodity trading, in anything to do with finance, financial services. And you can argue that 90% of their employees are coming from that background, and a lot of them also know the domain. That's not the case of Planet today. So I kind of see that as their vision. So for that to happen, they may need to do a few acquisitions down the lane, and they need to go deeper into the area. And I think it's important to kind of also differentiate between, kind of the horizontal nature of the technology of Earth observation, but also the vertical nature of going deeper into it. And if you ask me, there's not been many examples in the industry that have cracked both horizontal and deeper, which is why if you see also examples from other industries, AWS, or let's say the parent company Amazon, is a leader in e-commerce. So e-commerce is an area they go deeper into, and then AWS is kind of the horizontal technology. They don't create a cloud service for retail. They have a cloud service. So I think Earth observation companies are probably going to be reaching a stage where they will be horizontal, and I think they will have success with being horizontal. Some of them will probably attempt to go deeper, but then the problem with going deeper is you have to compromise on your horizontal nature, right? Like if Planet goes deeper and deeper into financial services, they may have to, not give up, but reduce their focus in agriculture, but they have a good market in agriculture. So why would you not do that, right? So I think the reality is a lot of companies will try to kind of do the horizontal part, especially companies that are multi-vertical. There are a couple of companies that are very, very, vertical focused. And I think that graphic that distinguishes between, horizontal and vertical says that, because there are companies now, for example, a German company called Constellar. They are very much focused on launching a thermal infrared sensor for measuring land surface temperature that is useful for agriculture. That's it. That's their vision. They have talked about their sensor. They have talked about their vision. They talked about which band they're focusing on, only focused on agriculture, and that's it. They can also go into other areas, because thermal infrared can also look at buildings. It can look at heat. It can look at wildfires. But then that's not what they're focusing on. They're focusing on agriculture. So there are going to be examples of companies that also do just that. And Aurora Tech is just another example. Also thermal sensor, but very much focused on wildfire. Their main focus is wildfire. So I think that's kind of how companies are going to grow. So Planet, I think, is probably going to be, expanding wide, and also because they have a first mover advantage today, because they have so many satellites already in space.
Thank you.
Sam, and then Tim.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. Very inspiring cross-section. Can you update us a little bit about accuracies? And can these different technologies, what kind of resolutions and or trends, or so? Where are we here?
So in terms of resolution, so you can look at resolution. I'm guessing you're kind of talking about resolution on a spatial level, because resolution can also be on a temporal level, meaning how frequent the image is taken. It can also be on a spectral level, meaning how deeper are you looking into the image? Are you looking at 200 bands, or are you just looking at RGB? So that can also be, but I'm guessing you're talking about spatial. So the spatial resolution, obviously Sentinel is more in the 10-meter resolution. That is kind of the low resolution these days. And the highest resolution that is starting to be available is 15 centimeter. So 15 centimeter per pixel. So every image that you look at is 15 centimeter on the ground, which is huge, because now you can kind of differentiate between buildings, cars, and I think there are companies now that are in development that want to launch satellites in very low Earth orbit, so very close to very close to the atmosphere, but then just above the atmosphere. So it's more in the, let's say, in the 200 kilometer, 250 kilometer range in orbit. Sorry, and usually LEO orbits for a lot of Earth observation satellites are in the average 500 kilometer range. But then there are companies that are obviously launching their satellites with very good propulsion that can be very low, so they can get a very high resolution. So they're targeting 10 centimeter, and I think they'll be available in the next couple of years. So I think, yeah, we're getting towards 10 centimeter, but obviously we will have physics that will block us from getting to 1 centimeter, because you cannot really fly that close, or really you cannot really have that big of an aperture. But we're gonna also see what the what the comparison is with existing technologies. You know, if they are flying in such a low orbit, but then their data quality is not good enough, then you will continue taking imagery via drones or balloons, which are also coming up, as I mentioned. So I think from a satellite point of view, I think we will get as close as possible, because the advantage of satellites is, you know, obviously they're always on, and, you know, balloons and drones need to be deployed. But then even on the balloon side, on the high altitude balloon side, you know, we see a lot of kind of development happening on balloons that fly in, let's say, in 8, 10, 20 kilometers, which is also very good for taking an image, especially because they can be more static compared to a satellite. So that, I think that those technologies should also be kind of kept in mind in terms of resolution. But yeah, satellite is going down to 10 centimeter. That's the short answer.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Aravind. A great presentation. I'm coming from the side of traffic management in space.
Mm-hmm. Yep, can you hear me?
Okay, and you introduced that the user of EO services are not so much interested in how the service was and how the application was generated. Now, taking the position of providing operations of satellites, how do you see the situation for EO constellations? Are they in the future ready to take operation as a service? Do they rent the space infrastructure, or do they want to own their own space infrastructure in the future? How do you see it? Thanks.
It's a combination of both. I didn't include that slide. I'm trying to see if I have that as a backup slide somewhere. So there are 5 ways that exist for launching satellites today. One of them is the way that you're suggesting, where you go with the payload and they'll take care of everything, meaning take care of the platform and launch the satellite for you. That's happening, starting to happen a lot. Obviously, there are the traditional ways of kind of outsourcing the end-to-end process, but I think there are two models that are coming up. One is, well, what you call space as a service. So you go with the payload and they take care and launch everything. We have seen that happen with Aurora Tech. So Spire provides that service. We have started to see that in the US with I think Hydrosat and Muon Space, and I think it's the same case with Open Cosmos in the UK as well. So there are a few companies that are coming up that are providing these models, space as a service models, which is probably not going to go away, because they allow, you know, let's say a risk-free way to demonstrate and test different types of payloads. So I don't think they're going to go away. They have a lot of demand, and we have seen that in one case. Thanks, Wendy. In one case, we've seen a full constellation being deployed that way. So there's a company called Earth Daily Analytics, who is building satellites completely from Loft Orbital. So they are providing them the payload, and Loft Orbital is launching and, you know, operating the satellite, everything on their own. And Earth Daily is going to be very focused on just taking the data and, you know, developing products based on that data. So it's starting to happen more and more. So I think a lot of satellite operators are going to, you know, let's say it's a 50-50. There are some that are still going to be very vertically integrated because they want to own the end-to-end process. So there's a company called Albedo in the US that is actually the one that is 10 centimeter satellites in very low Earth orbit. They are managing the end-to-end process because their IP is also their propulsion system. So I think it really boils down to what the company's company's differentiation is. If their differentiation is the payload, then they will just take the payload and launch it with anybody. But then if they're also developing a propulsion system, or if they're also developing, you know, an attitude determining system that is proprietary, then they will try to own that process. I think that's kind of how it's going. But yeah, I think the increase in space as a service is actually helping the market a lot to deploy more payloads.
Cool. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Rod.
Thank you. So I see Rebecca and Max. Any question to Aravind? I know that impact project of Rebecca is about Earth observation and the analytics of it. So I don't know, Rebecca, any question to Aravind?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was wondering mostly about, you said that there's a lot of emerging market happening, especially in the vertical space. And I was wondering where you're seeing most of that. Like, what is the new promise here that has excited those new businesses?
So you mean from emerging market from a geography point of view, or from a
No,
application
sorry,
point of
I
view?
meant from the tech. You said that there's certain areas that are still more traditional. There's agriculture and so on and so forth. There's
Correct.
more businesses that are opening up nowadays for things like flooding and insurance. And so I'm just kind of wondering, what have you seen as like, where is there more of that emerging market, and what is the reasoning behind it?
Right. I think one thing I mentioned, so I would kind of put usually agriculture and oil and gas in the traditional category, just because they have been historical users of remote sensing data for decades. So they are not new. They are probably discovering new use cases, right? Like they probably had to not report their impact on biodiversity before, and now they have to. They didn't have to report their deforestation before from an agriculture point of view, but then now they have to. So their use cases are expanding, but then they are historical users. But then if you look at the financial services, banks and insurance companies, they're kind of looking at Earth observation new, and obviously their use cases are new, but then also their value proposition is also new. For example, the insurance sector, I think I mentioned the claims assessment as an example. Another example is more in the commodity trading space. So it's important for commodity traders to have, as real-time, as quick information as possible in order so that they can kind of, I guess, hedge their bets better or invest better. I think, Earth observation data is very useful for them to know if there is going to be risk of a yield for a specific crop, or whether a ship that is transporting oil or transporting minerals is going to be stuck in the Suez Canal. Those are information that if they know, then they can make better decisions. So that's more it's all also very strategic as well. So it's like whoever gets the information first is probably going to make a better decision. So I think it's also the real-time nature of satellite is also becoming more interesting for them. So those are just two applications that come off the top of my head. But then also one thing to keep in mind on the emerging side is also use cases that are always existed but never really been useful. So like you can always use satellites or you have had satellites to track emissions, but then organizations didn't need to report emission data. You can use satellite data to identify the risk of an area for floods or wildfires, but this was not a product before. Right now, wildfire risk insurance is a product, flood risk insurance is a product. So I think climate, if you just take as one big driver, is also leading to a lot more emerging applications.
Thank you. Max.
I don't really have a question here. I mean, I have worked before in the Philab, so it's something that I work a lot on that. One thing that maybe I was wondering if you know is if you have any figure of how big is the investment from agency as early adopter of innovation with respect to the rest of the market. I mean, because what I see is this. I mean, the first kickoff, and then sometimes they can stand on their own leg. Sometimes it doesn't. So I was wondering if you have any figure of how much of the market is covered by agency like ESA as early adopter, and how much is really commercial end user market.
Yeah, I think the split I think the split that is easy to determine is more from a government versus commercial, and it looks like more of a 70-30. So 30% is the commercial and 70% is still government. Obviously, a lot of that 70% is still the defense sector and the defense organizations. So the public sector use cases there is more from a 5 to 10% of that overall market. So out of the 70, 5 to 10 is more the civilian use cases. So, the ESA contracts for CCM, so the Copernicus contributing missions, but also the NASA. NASA has their commercial satellite data acquisition program, and NOAA has similar for weather data. So I think those are kind of rough ballparks, but I think it's the trend is kind of on an increasing level. So I think the ESA's, I think last year, ESA had a new multi-million euro contract for I think 7 or 8 European Earth observation companies for Copernicus contributing missions. So I think that is increasing, and I think we're going to see more increase. Obviously, you need to include the new satellite constellations into that mix. I mean, I didn't have time to talk about that, but obviously, as you would have seen, Greece, Italy, Poland, Bulgaria, UK, Spain, Portugal, a lot of them are in the process of launching their own satellite constellation. So I think that is also something that needs to be included in that figure. And these are all just up and coming, right? So I think probably Italy left in that list. So a lot of European countries, surprisingly, also but UAE, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and I think Brazil as well. So Egypt, there are a few countries that are, launching their own national EO constellation as well. So, they're not just focused on buying the data, they also want to launch their own proprietary assets into space. So I think they're more focused on also encouraging and developing their own industry. So I think this is kind of, they're not buying data, but it's a different way of investing into Earth observation.
Also Portugal, by the way, just because there's Nova, just to mention that.
Yeah. Well, I think I mentioned Portugal in my list. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear. So
I did. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of upcoming constellations, exciting times.
Yeah. It's, we are managing here in ESA. We are giving a hand to manage all this program.
Yeah, exactly.
And to kind of also coordinate.
Be the technology partner. Yeah, 100%.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
and also missions like Scouts, right? Like we don't know what's going to happen after the mission is launched, right? Like maybe there will be a commercial derivative of Scouts. And
yes, exactly.
I think this is a trend. This is a trend that has started to happen in the US. For instance, there was a US NASA mission that was launched a few years ago. Well, last year actually, but then the first demonstration was launched called Tropics. And there was a company that licensed the technology from NASA and is now commercializing it. We have not seen that in Europe, but I think it's also going to happen where you will see.
For example, for the first Scout, now one of the things that I noticed, you didn't mention the GNSS reflectometer. That is something that in ESA we are pushing a lot, and was one of the first Scout mission, and then
and now Spire is doing it.
Exactly. Also. Spire, also the next Amazon satellite in Brazil is going to use that. Is something that is on the
on the rise.
On the rising, rising of innovation. Yes, could be one is one of the things on which is a thing that will be in the future because it's not very expensive as technology and it's very promising.
No, great. I think we are almost concluding, and Max, looking forward to discuss further with you here in Lisbon.
Yes, with about the Portuguese
of course.
constellation.
Maybe just a very quick answer, Aravind, because I think you didn't went through this at least more in depth. Regarding the global south, so continents as Africa. When you talk about the word consolidation, this can be scary because maybe some companies will be bankrupt, But at the same time, continents and specific countries in Africa will push a lot in the sector of Earth observation. Do you want to comment on this? Because maybe this will drive more the market quickly.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think there's a lot of needs that are not really met by companies in the West. So if you look at a company called Sature, that is an Indian company that is launching its own satellites and not buying data from other Western companies because the data and the prices of the data does not really work for building solution in India. And I think this is only a trend that is only going to continue because the prices that are of satellite imagery today are not compatible with how the pricing of any of the global south will work. So Satshore is just the first example of a company that is building its own constellation because of predominantly price reasons, not only price, but also other reasons, but price is a major factor. And I think we will continue to see that. And I think that's why we're starting to see Egypt that is launching satellites, South Africa is looking at satellites. So I think we will see as the prices go down even more, the launch price. Hopefully now the launch price is not going down very much because there's only 2 launchers today in Rocket Lab and SpaceX. But then in the next 3 to 5 years, as more launchers come in, the launch prices will go down even further. So there's a very good chance that a lot of these countries will invest in Earth observation constellations. So the way Europe is doing now, I think it's probably going to be an example of how to also do it for the other countries, because every country has different needs, right? Like if you look at DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, it's all about monitoring their forests for carbon, because a lot of carbon markets are taking place in Africa, and a lot of verification needs to happen on whether it's actually adding to the forest or not. And same with Indonesia. And I think those countries are going to go and, basically take advantage of the low prices of launch and invest in their own capabilities, but also develop their own solutions. So, that's a trend that has not begun in a very big way yet, but it's definitely going to be something that's going to happen in the next 5-10 years.
Okay, great. So Aravind, thank you very much. We need to conclude once more. Very insightful, at least for myself, and I think for all the participants. And to conclude and to close the session, I pass the word to João. And Aravind, once more, on behalf of NOVA, thank you very much. And certainly we'll keep in touch for other opportunities regarding Earth observation and these ongoing challenges and opportunities. So, João, back to you to conclude and close the session.
Thank you, Emir. And also thank you, Aravind. Thank everyone for attending. This is an emerging and young and very private space segment, Earth observation. So I think we'll have news on this throughout the coming years. So let's everyone keep an eye open. So this concludes the 3rd out of 4 sessions. This Thursday we'll have the last one. Please be aware that it will start a quarter, 15 minutes before the usual time, so 15 minutes earlier. It should be 5:45 CET, so I believe everyone's time. And we will see you all here in Lisbon on the Monday morning. Please see if you have everything arranged. If not, and you need any assistance, please let us know. We can help you sort any last-minute details that have gone amiss. Just a quick note, we will be handing out, as soon as I receive them, for the people that are going to join the lesson, a quick survey on if you want to get the suit, so which kind of suit you want, and other information that the school requires. Even if you're not surfing, you are welcome to join everybody at the beach earlier, or we can meet at the scheduled time here at NOVA. So everyone, thank you for coming. It was great to see you all and share this hour with you. Thank you, everyone.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.